Ukraine's leadership in crisis, the unseen collapse behind the headlines. Let me take you back to the evening of February 8, 2024. That was the night Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in a rare primetime address, announced the dismissal of his top military commander, General Valery Zaluzhnyi. The official reason? A reset of the war effort, a necessary shakeup to break the stalemate in the East. Western media dutifully reported it as a bold leadership move, a sign of Zelensky's determination to adapt to a changing battlefield. The New York Times called it a high-stakes gamble. The BBC framed it as a desperate but necessary decision. And for a few days, the narrative Ukraine was recalibrating, the West was standing firm, and victory, though delayed, remained within reach. But here's what they didn't tell you. That night wasn't just about a personnel change. It was the first public crack in a dam that's been straining for months. And if you know where to look, you can see the water seeping through. I've spent the last 3 decades studying wars of attrition, collapsed states, and the brittle politics of regimes under extreme stress. I've advised generals, testified before Congress, and watched empires repeat the same mistakes: overconfidence, miscalculation, the refusal to accept hard truths until it's too late. What's happening in Ukraine right now isn't just a military setback. It's a leadership crisis in full collapse mode, and the West is still pretending it's a temporary rough patch. That's dangerous. Because when a government in wartime starts fracturing at the seams, the consequences aren't just local, they reshape the global order. So let's start with the story they're selling you. The official A war of resolve and renewal. According to the Biden administration, NATO, and the chorus of think tanks in Washington and Brussels, Ukraine's situation in early 2024 is difficult but manageable. The summer counteroffensive failed to achieve its objectives, yes, but the West insists this was always a long war. The $61 billion aid package finally passed by Congress in April 2024, after months of partisan gridlock, was hailed as a lifeline. Secretary of State Antony Blinken called it a turning point. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg declared that Ukraine's victory is inevitable. Even the Pentagon, in its more cautious moments, has stuck to the line that Russia is running out of steam, that its manpower and industrial base are stretched thin, and that time is on Ukraine's side. The numbers seem to back this up, at least on the surface. The U.S. has committed over $175 billion in military, economic, and humanitarian aid to Ukraine since 2022. The EU has pledged another €50 billion. Ukraine's military, once a ragtag force, is now one of the most technologically advanced in Europe, equipped with HIMARS, Leopard tanks, and F-16s on the way. Intelligence reports suggest Russia has lost nearly 300,000 soldiers killed or wounded, an unsustainable rate. And despite the setbacks, Ukraine still controls roughly 80% of its pre-2014 territory, including major cities like Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Odessa. The message is Ukraine is holding the line. The West is united. And with enough patience and resources, Russia will eventually buckle. As President Biden put it in his State of the Union address, Putin's war of conquest is failing. Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not just optimistic. It's delusional. The hidden fractures in Ukraine's leadership. Let's start with the numbers. The idea that Russia is running out of steam is a fantasy. Since 2022, Russia has mobilized its economy for total war. Defense spending now accounts for nearly 40% of the federal budget. Military production has surged: artillery shells, drones, missiles, at a rate the West can't match. The U.S. is struggling to produce 30,000 shells a month, Russia is churning out 250,000. And while Western sanctions have hurt, they haven't crippled Russia's war machine. Critical components are still flowing in through third countries: Turkey, the UAE, China. The Russian ruble is stable. Inflation is under control. And most importantly, Putin has successfully framed this as an existential war for Russia, which means he can sustain losses that would break a Western democracy. Now, look at Ukraine. The counteroffensive of 2023 was supposed to be a game-changer. Instead, it became a case study in military overreach. Ukrainian forces, trained and equipped by NATO, launched assaults on heavily fortified Russian positions only to be chewed up by minefields, drones, and artillery. The vaunted Western armored Leopards, Bradleys, Challengers proved vulnerable to Russian anti-tank missiles and FPV drones. By the time the offensive stalled in November, Ukraine had lost an estimated 70,000 soldiers and gained a few kilometers of territory at best. That's not a stalemate. That's a defeat. But the real crisis isn't on the battlefield. It's in Kyiv. Zelensky's firing of Zaluzhnyi wasn't just a military decision. It was a political earthquake. Zaluzhnyi wasn't just a general, he was the most trusted figure in Ukraine, more popular than Zelensky himself. Polls showed that if Zaluzhnyi ran for president, he'd win in a landslide. His dismissal wasn't about strategy. It was about survival. Zelensky, facing plummeting approval ratings, a restive population, and a military that's exhausted and demoralized, needed a scapegoat. And Zaluzhnyi, with his independent streak and refusal to sugarcoat the war's realities, was the perfect target. Here's what's really happening. Ukraine's leadership is in a death spiral. Zelensky's inner circle is shrinking, his authority eroding. The military is fracturing, some units are loyal to Zaluzhnyi's replacement, General Syrskyi, but others see him as a political appointee. Corruption, always a problem in Ukraine, is now ramped. The Wall Street Journal reported in January that $40 million in U.S. aid meant for frontline troops was embezzled by officials in the defense ministry. And the draft is becoming a powder keg. Men are fleeing the country to avoid conscription. Those who can't are being rounded up in brutal filtration operations. The social contract that held Ukraine together in 2022 is unraveling. And then there's the West. The $61 billion aid package? It's a band-aid on a bullet wound. The money will keep Ukraine fighting for another year, maybe two. But it won't change the fundamental: Russia has more men, more shells, and more staying power. The US is distracted by elections, by China, by its own domestic crises. Europe is divided, Hungary and Slovakia are openly pro-Russian, Germany is cutting aid, France is talking big but delivering little. And the longer this war drags on, the more the West's unity will fray. So let's be clear. Ukraine isn't just losing the war. Its leadership is losing control. And the West is sleepwalking into a disaster. The geopolitical why this war was never just about Ukraine. Now, let's out. Because this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the future of the global order. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under a simple that it can maintain a unipolar world, where American power is unchallenged, where NATO extends to Russia's borders, where China is contained, and where the rules-based international order is enforced by US military might. That assumption is now collapsing. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was never just about Ukraine. It was about Russia's place in the world. Putin has been clear, for he sees NATO action as an existential threat. The 2014 coup in Kyiv, the push to bring Ukraine into NATO, the West's refusal to negotiate Russia's security concerns, all of this convinced Putin that the US was determined to encircle and weaken Russia. And when he launched his invasion in 2022, he wasn't just gambling on a quick victory. He was making it the unipolar moment is over. Now, let's talk about China. Beijing has been watching this war closely, and what it sees is a US that's overstretched, a Europe that's divided, and a Russia that, despite the early setbacks, is still standing. China's support for Russia isn't just about ideology. It's about strategy. If Russia can bog down the West in Ukraine, it weakens America's ability to pivot to Asia. And if Ukraine falls, it sends a message to the US: can't save you. This is the real geopolitical game. It's not about democracy versus autocracy. It's about spheres of influence. The US has spent decades extending its influence: NATO in Europe, alliances in Asia, military bases everywhere. Russia and China are pushing back. They're not trying to conquer the world. They're trying to create a multipolar order where the US can't dictate terms. And here's the irony. The harder the US pushes in Ukraine, the more it accelerates that shift. Every dollar spent on HIMARS is a dollar not spent on Taiwan. Every NATO soldier deployed to Poland is one not available for the South China Sea. The longer this war drags on, the more the US bleeds resources, the more its allies question its reliability, and the more Russia and China tighten their alliance. This is classic great power politics. And the US is losing. Military: the illusion of a winnable war. Let's talk about the military situation. Because the idea that Ukraine can still win this war is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare. First, the balance of forces. Russia has mobilized its entire economy for war. It's producing artillery shells at a rate of 2.5 million per year. Ukraine, even with Western aid, is firing 2,000 a day. That's a 10:1 disadvantage. Russia has more men, more tanks, more drones, more everything. And while Western weapons are high-tech, they're not enough to offset Russia's quantitative advantage. A single HIMARS rocket costs $150,000. A Russian drone costs $500. Do the math. Second, the battlefield. The front line hasn't moved significantly in over a year. Russia has dug in, built layered defenses, and turned the Donbass into a meat grinder. Ukraine's army is exhausted. Its best units have been decimated. The new conscripts are poorly trained, poorly equipped, and poorly motivated. And the West's promise of F-16s? They won't arrive until late 2024, and even then, they'll be outnumbered by Russia's Air Force. Third, the nuclear threat. Putin has repeatedly signaled that if Russia faces an existential threat, he will use tactical nukes. The US and NATO have no good response to this. Escalate and risk Armageddon? Back down and lose credibility? This is the dilemma that keeps generals up at night. And let's not forget the lessons of history. The US has a long track record of underestimating its enemies. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. In each case, the US assumed its technological superiority would guarantee victory. In each case, it was wrong. Russia is not Iraq. It's not Afghanistan. It's a nuclear-armed superpower with a population of 140 million and an economy that's weathered sanctions. The idea that the US can bleed Russia dry without bleeding itself is fantasy. So what's the endgame? The hawks in Washington will tell you that if we just send more weapons, if we just stay the course, Ukraine will prevail. But that's not strategy. That's wishful thinking. The reality is that Ukraine is running out of time, out of men, and out of options. And the longer this war drags on, the worse the outcome will be for Ukraine, for Europe, and for the US. The domestic political why the US can't walk away. Now, let's talk about the politics. Because this war isn't just about Ukraine. It's about America's domestic divisions, its electoral calendar, and the cynical calculations of its leaders. The Biden administration has tied its legacy to Ukraine. After the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, Biden needed a foreign policy win. Ukraine was it. The narrative was America is back. NATO is united. Democracy is on the march. And for a while, it worked. The West rallied behind Ukraine. Sanctions crippled Russia. The war became a moral crusade. But then reality set in. The counteroffensive failed. Russia adapted. The war became a stalemate. And the American public, which initially supported Ukraine, started to ask questions. Why are we sending billions to Kiev when our own cities are crumbling? Why are we risking war with Russia over a country most Americans can't find on a map? The administration's response? Double down. Frame the war as a struggle between democracy and autocracy. Paint anyone who questions the strategy as a Putin puppet. And hope that the $61 billion aid package will buy enough time to get through the 2024 election. But here's the problem. The American people aren't stupid. They see the contradictions. They see a president who says the US won't send troops to Ukraine but deploys special forces to the country anyway. They see a Congress that can't pass a budget but can approve billions for a war with no end in sight. And they see a media that treats any criticism of Ukraine as heresy. This is unsustainable. The longer the war drags on, the more the American public will turn against it. And the more the public turns against it, the more the administration will be forced to escalate, because walking away would be political suicide. This is the trap. The US can't win the war. But it can't afford to lose it either. So it keeps pouring money and weapons into a black hole, hoping for a miracle. And all the while, the real beneficiaries, Russia and China, are watching, waiting, and preparing for the next phase. Scenario: the road to disaster. So where does this end? Let's look at the possibilities. Scenario 1: the frozen conflict. In this scenario, the war grinds on for years, neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. Ukraine becomes a permanent client state of the West, dependent on endless aid. Russia digs in, turns the Donbass into a fortified zone, and waits for the West to lose interest. The US and Europe grow weary, sanctions erode, and the war fades from the headlines. This is the Korean War model: a temporary truce, no real peace, and a permanent state of tension. This is the best-case scenario. But it's still a disaster. Ukraine is destroyed. Europe is divided. And the US is stuck in another endless war. Scenario 2: the Ukrainian collapse. This is the most likely outcome. Ukraine's military collapses under the weight of Russian manpower and firepower. Zelensky is overthrown or flees. A pro-Russian government takes power in Kiev. NATO is humiliated. The US faces a escalate and risk war with Russia, or accept defeat and lose credibility. This is where we're headed. The signs are already there. Ukraine's manpower crisis. Its economic collapse. The West's waning support. And Russia's relentless pressure. If this happens, it will be a geopolitical earthquake. China will be emboldened. Taiwan will be in, and the US will face the biggest foreign policy crisis since the fall of Saigon. Scenario 3: the escalation spiral. This is the nightmare scenario. The US and NATO, desperate to avoid defeat, escalate. They send troops to Ukraine. They impose a no-fly zone. They target Russian territory. Putin responds with tactical nukes. The war goes global. This is unlikely, but not impossible. The hawks in Washington are already pushing for it. And if Ukraine collapses, the pressure to do something will be overwhelming. This is how great powers stumble into catastrophe. Grand the folly of liberal hegemony. Let's step back and ask the big question. Why is the US in this mess? The answer is because for the last 30 years, the US has pursued a grand strategy of liberal hegemony, the idea that America can and should remake the world in its image. That NATO should EXD to Russia's borders. That China should be contained. That the US should be the world's policeman. This strategy has failed. Spectacularly. Look at the record. The Iraq War was a disaster. Afghanistan was a disaster. Libya was a disaster. Syria was a disaster. And now Ukraine is a disaster. In each case, the US overestimated its power, underestimated its enemies, and ignored the limits of its influence. The problem isn't just bad execution. It's the strategy itself. The world is not a unipolar system. It's a multipolar system. Russia and China are not going to accept US dominance. They're going to push back. And the more the US tries to impose its will, the more it will provoke resistance. This is the lesson of history. Empires collapse when they overreach. The British Empire. The Soviet Union. And now, the American Empire. The US needs a new grand strategy. One based on realism, not idealism. One that accepts the limits of American power. One that prioritizes diplomacy over war, stability over regime change, and national interests over global crusades. But that's not what we're getting. Instead, we're getting more of the same: more wars, more interventions, more hubris. And the result will be the more failure. What should be a realist path forward? So what's the alternative? How do we avoid disaster? First, the US needs to accept that Ukraine cannot win this war. Not militarily. The best outcome Ukraine can hope for is a negotiated settlement that preserves its sovereignty while acknowledging the reality of Russian control over Crimea and parts of the Donbass. That's not surrender, it's statecraft. The alternative is total collapse, a humanitarian catastrophe, and a permanent frozen conflict that bleeds both Ukraine and the West dry for decades. Now, what most people don't realize is that this war was never just about Ukraine. It's about the future of the European security order, and more broadly, the balance of power in Eurasia. Russia's invasion was a direct challenge to the post-Cold War arrangement, where NATO exited eastward while Moscow was told to accept its diminished status. That arrangement was always unstable. The question was never if Russia would push back, but when and how. We got our answer on February 24, 2022. Let me explain why this matters beyond Ukraine's borders. The war has exposed the fundamental weakness of the US-led order in Europe. NATO, for all its military might, is a paper tiger when it comes to sustaining a prolonged conventional war. The alliance's defense industrial base is a shadow of what it was during the Cold War. The US is burning through its stockpiles of artillery shells, missiles, and drones at a rate that would have been unthinkable even 5 years ago. The Europeans? They're worse off. Germany, the economic powerhouse of the continent, can't even meet its own defense spending commitments, let alone supply Ukraine with the heavy weapons it needs. The much-touted European pillar of NATO is a myth. Here's the uncomfortable: the West is not prepared for a long war. Russia is. That's not because Russia is stronger, it's because Russia has structured its economy and military around the reality of great power competition, while the West has spent the last 3 decades outsourcing its defense to globalization and just-in-time supply chains. The sanctions regime, which was supposed to cripple Russia's war machine, has instead forced Moscow to adapt. Russian defense production is now higher than it was before the war. Their economy, while not thriving, is stable. And their military, for all its early blunders, has learned, adapted, and is now grinding forward in Donbass. Meanwhile, the US is running out of time. The 2024 election is looming, and with it, the very real possibility that American support for Ukraine could evaporate overnight. If Trump wins, he's made it clear he'll cut off aid and push Zelensky to the negotiating table. Even if Biden wins, the political will to keep funding this war indefinitely is fading. The American public is war-weary. The progressive left is increasingly vocal about the cost of the war. And the isolationist right, which has always been skeptical of foreign entanglements, is gaining ground. So where does that leave us? If Ukraine can't win militarily, and the West can't sustain its support indefinitely, then the only rational path forward is diplomacy. But here's the diplomacy requires leverage. And right now, the West has none. Russia holds the initiative on the battlefield. They control nearly 20% of Ukraine's territory. They've weathered the sanctions storm. And they've secured tacit support from China, Iran, and North Korea, enough to keep their war machine running. The longer this drags on, the worse Ukraine's position becomes. That's why the next 6 months are critical. If the US and Europe want to salvage anything from this disaster, they need to shift from a strategy of Ukraine must win to one of Ukraine must survive. That means pushing for a ceasefire, freezing the front lines where they are, and negotiating a settlement that trades territory for security guarantees. It's not pretty. It's not just. But it's the only way to prevent a complete collapse. Now, I can already hear the objections. We can't reward Russian aggression. This will only embolden Putin. What about the Ukrainian people? These are emotional arguments, not strategic ones. The hard truth is that great powers don't go to war for justice, they go to war for interests. And right now, the US and Europe have no vital interests at stake in Ukraine that justify the risk of a wider war with Russia. The idea that we can bleed Russia dry without risking escalation is a fantasy. The idea that we can force Russia to withdraw from Crimea is a delusion. Let's look at history for a moment. In 1956, Hungary revolted against Soviet rule. The US encouraged the uprising, but when the Soviets rolled in with tanks, we did nothing. Why? Because Hungary was behind the Iron Curtain, and the risk of war with the USSR was too great. In 1968, Czechoslovakia tried to liberalize. The Soviets invaded. Again, the US did nothing. Why? Because the alternative was nuclear war. The same logic applies today. Ukraine is not a NATO member. It's not a vital US interest. And the cost of direct intervention is simply too high. That doesn't mean we abandon Ukraine. It means we stop pretending this war can be won on the battlefield. It means we start thinking about how to rebuild Ukraine after the war, not how to prolong a conflict that's already destroyed the country. It means we accept that Russia is a great power, not a declining one, and that we need to find a way to coexist with it, just as we coexisted with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The alternative is unthinkable. If Ukraine collapses, the consequences will be catastrophic. Millions more refugees will flood into Europe. The Black Sea will become a Russian lake. Moldova and Georgia will be next on Putin's list. And the credibility of NATO, already shaken, will be in tatters. The only way to prevent that is to negotiate from a position of strength, which, unfortunately, we no longer have. So what should the US do? First, stop the escalatory rhetoric. No more talk of regime change in Moscow. No more calls for Ukraine to win back every inch. That's not strategy, it's wishful thinking. Second, start back-channel diplomacy with Russia. Explore what a ceasefire would look like. Test whether Moscow is serious about negotiations. Third, prepare for the post-war reality. Ukraine will need massive reconstruction aid. It will need security guarantees. And it will need a path to EU membership, though not NATO, because that's a red line for Russia. Most importantly, the US needs to learn the right lessons from this war. The era of liberal hegemony is over. The world is multipolar, and America's relative power is declining. That doesn't mean we're doomed, it means we need to be smarter. We need to prioritize our core: defending the homeland, maintaining a favorable balance of power in Europe and Asia, and preserving the global commons. Everything else is a distraction. The war in Ukraine has been a wake-up call. The question is whether we'll hit snooze or finally wake up. Now, what most people don't realize is that the crisis in Ukraine isn't just a military or geopolitical failure, it's a domestic political disaster waiting to explode. And I'm not just talking about Kyiv. I'm talking about Washington, Brussels, and every capital that's been cheerleading this war without thinking through the consequences. Because when the music stops, and it will, someone's going to have to answer for the wreckage. And right now, no one in power seems prepared to face that reckoning. Let's start with Ukraine itself. Zelensky's government is running on fumes. The man who was elected in 2019 on a platform of peace and anti-corruption has become a wartime president by default, not by design. And that's a problem. Because in a democracy, even a flawed one like Ukraine, legitimacy matters. Zelensky's approval ratings have been propped up by Western media hagiography and a steady diet of battlefield heroics, but beneath the surface, the cracks are widening. The martial law that's been in place since February 2022 has suspended elections, muzzled opposition parties, and centralized power to an unprecedented degree. That might have been necessary in the early days of the invasion, but 2 years later, it's starting to look like a permanent state of exception. And in my experience, when leaders start ruling by decree, they don't give up power easily. Here's the uncomfortable: Ukraine's political system was already fragile before the war. The 2014 Maidan revolution toppled a corrupt, pro-Russian president, but it didn't fix the underlying rot. The oligarchs, men like Rinat Akhmatov, Ihor Kolomoisky, and Viktor Pinchuk, still pull the strings behind the. Now, let's talk about the military. The Ukrainian armed forces have been lionized in the Western press as the plucky underdogs standing up to the Russian bear. And to be fair, they've fought bravely. But bravery alone doesn't win wars. The reality is that Ukraine's military is exhausted. The summer 2023 counteroffensive was a disaster, not because Ukrainian soldiers didn't try, but because the West set them up for failure. We gave them just enough weapons to keep fighting, but not enough to win. We trained them on NATO tactics that don't work against a dug-in Russian defense. And we ignored the fact that Russia's manpower and industrial base are simply too large to overcome. The result? Thousands of dead, hundreds of armored vehicles destroyed, and no meaningful territorial gains. And now, with Western aid drying up and Russia ramping up its own production, the balance is shifting. The Ukrainians know it. The Russians know it. The only people who don't seem to know it are the politicians in Washington and Brussels. Which brings me to the domestic political dimension in the West. The war in Ukraine has become a litmus test for Western unity, but it's also exposed deep divisions. In the United States, support for Ukraine is increasingly partisan. The Biden administration has staked its legacy on this war, framing it as a battle between democracy and autocracy. But the Republican base is growing skeptical. A Pew Research poll from January 2024 found that only 31% of Republicans believe the U.S. is providing the right amount of support to Ukraine, down from 44% a year earlier. And with Trump leading in the polls, the prospect of a sudden shift in U.S. policy is very real. Imagine a scenario where Trump wins in November and immediately cuts off aid to Ukraine. What happens then? Does Europe step up? Or does Ukraine collapse? Europe's not in much better shape. The EU has committed over €80 billion in aid to Ukraine since the start of the war, but public support is waning. In Germany, the far-right AfD is surging in the polls, partly on an anti-Ukraine platform. In France, Marine Le Pen's national rally is gaining ground with similar rhetoric. And in Eastern Europe, countries like Hungary and Slovakia are openly defying Brussels on Ukraine policy. Viktor Orbán has made no secret of his desire to see a negotiated settlement, and he's not alone. The longer the war drags on, the more these divisions will deepen. And if Ukraine starts losing on the battlefield, the political fallout in Europe could be catastrophic. So what are the possible scenarios? Let me lay out the most likely ones. First, the best case, a negotiated settlement. This would require the West to accept that Ukraine can't win militarily and that some territorial concessions are inevitable. It would also require Russia to accept that it can't achieve its maximalist goals, regime change in Kyiv, the complete subjugation of Ukraine. The problem? Neither side is ready for this. Zelensky has staked his political survival on the idea that Ukraine can retake all its territory, including Crimea. Putin, for his part, has framed this war as an existential struggle, and he's not about to back down without something to show for it. But if the US and Europe start pushing for negotiations in earnest, and if they're willing to offer security guarantees and reconstruction aid, a deal might be possible. It wouldn't be pretty, but it would end the bloodshed. Second, the most likely, a frozen conflict. This is where we're headed if neither side can achieve a decisive victory and neither side is willing to negotiate. Think Korea, but with a lot more artillery and a lot less stability. Ukraine would remain a de facto partition state, with Russia controlling the east and south, and the rest of the country limping along as a dysfunctional rump state. The West would continue to prop up Kyiv with just enough aid to keep it alive, but not enough to win. And Russia would use the occupied territories as a buffer zone, while continuing to destabilize the rest of Ukraine through sabotage and political subversion. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night, because it's the most unstable. Frozen conflicts have a way of thawing at the worst possible moment. Third, the worst case, a complete Ukrainian collapse. This would happen if Western aid dries up completely and Russia launches a major new offensive. The Ukrainian military is already stretched thin, and if the Russians break through the front lines, the retreat could turn into a rout. Millions more refugees would flood into Europe, and the political fallout would be devastating. NATO's credibility would be in tatters, and Russia would be emboldened to push further into Moldova, into the Baltics, even into Poland. The risk of a direct NATO-Russia confrontation would skyrocket. And the humanitarian cost would be unimaginable. Now, I know what some of you are: why are we sending billions to Ukraine when our own economies are struggling? And the more the elites double down, the more the populists gain ground. This is how democracies unravel, not with a bang, but with a whimper. One election at a time. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a choice. We can keep pretending that this war can be won on the battlefield, that Ukraine can retake Crimea, that Russia can be defeated without risking World War III. Or we can accept reality and start planning for the day after. The first option is a fantasy. The second option is hard, but it's the only one that makes sense. Here's what needs to happen. First, the US and Europe need to start preparing the public for the fact that Ukraine can't win this war. That doesn't mean abandoning Ukraine, it means being honest about what's possible. Second, we need to start back-channel diplomacy with Russia. Not because we like Putin, but because we need to find a way out of this mess. Third, we need to start thinking about reconstruction. Ukraine is going to need hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild, and the West is going to have to foot most of the bill. But we can't just throw money at the problem. We need to demand reforms, anti-corruption measures, judicial independence, economic liberalization. Otherwise, we'll just be pouring money into a black hole. Most importantly, we need to learn the right lessons from this war. The era of American hegemony is over. The world is multipolar, and we need to adjust our strategy accordingly. That means focusing on our core interests, defending the homeland, maintaining a favorable balance of power in Europe and Asia, and preserving the global commons. It means accepting that we can't fix every problem, and that sometimes, the best we can do is manage the fallout. The war in Ukraine has been a wake-up call. The question is whether we'll hit snooze or finally wake up. And if we don't, the consequences will be on us.